Good morning and welcome to Rising. Happy Friday. I'm Amber Duke, joined at the desk today by Niall Stanage. Good morning.
Great to see you, Amber. Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday.
How's your week been?
It's been a good week, a busy week, but going well. And of course, we have a busy weekend and Monday coming up with the inauguration just around the corner. The anticipation is building as we get closer to Inauguration Day. Much of the country will be watching President-elect Donald Trump get sworn into the White House for the second time. So who will be attending Monday's ceremony and who won't? Well, President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden are expected to be present at the ceremony, along with Bill and Hillary Clinton and even George W. and Laura Bush. Former President Barack Obama will be there, but his wife Michelle will not. The office of Barack and Michelle Obama said in a statement this week, former President Barack Obama is confirmed to attend the 60th inaugural ceremonies. Former First Lady Michelle Obama will not attend the upcoming inauguration.
And Nancy Pelosi's spokesperson announced Thursday that the Speaker Emerita will skip Trump's inauguration, but did not say why.
But political snubs go both ways. In an exit interview, First Lady Jill Biden told The Washington Post that incoming First Lady Melania Trump declined her invitation to tea at the White House, a long-running tradition between incoming and outgoing First Ladies. This is not the first time a member of the Trump family has declined an invitation from the Biden family. In 2020, of course, Trump refused to attend the inauguration of his successor, Joe Biden.
Now, returning to this year's guest list, we can't forget the Billionaires Boys Club. Tesla CEO Elon Musk, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, and Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, the new oligarchs, at least in the minds of Democrats, will be sitting alongside Trump's cabinet picks at the ceremony.
Musk posted on X that he was honored to attend. The Village People and Carrie Underwood will be performing at the inauguration, despite some backlash from fans. Trump has also invited many international leaders. There's Chinese President Xi Jinping, Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and Argentinian President Javier Milei.
It's unclear who, if any, in that particular bunch will attend. It normally isn't the case that foreign heads of state go to inaugurations. But it does signify Trump's proclivity toward authoritarian or populist leaders, and a sign, perhaps, critics would say, of what could be in store. Well, a lot to talk about here, Amber. First of all, the Michelle Obama matter obviously comes on top of her not going to the funeral of former President Carter, where her husband ended up beside President-elect Trump, and there was quite friendly chit-chat, which caused some discussion, I think, both on right and left. I don't think people should be compelled to attend inaugurations. If Michelle Obama doesn't want to go, I think that's fine. I do get a bit irked about people complaining about a lack of civility on her part when, as we noted in the introduction, Trump himself did not go to Biden's in 2020. But what's your read on all of this?
Yeah, I think it is what it is. I mean, there was a lot of speculation as to her reason for not attending, coupled with the fact that she did not attend the Carter funeral. And some people thought she could be ill. There may be tension in the marriage with Barack Obama. But then there was a People magazine report featuring a source close to Michelle Obama, which is usually the person,
right.
And saying that basically she just didn't want to attend because she didn't really like Trump.
Which is fine.
Okay,
you know?
sure, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anyone's going to get too up in arms about it. Look, the guy's going to be president.
Right.
Take the win, right?
Right.
But I mean, the interesting thing with the First Lady battle between Jill Biden and Melania Trump is that while those two have apparently had a little bit of a frosty relationship, there's also apparently an uncomfortable relationship between Kamala Harris and Usha Vance, because Usha Vance had reached out asking for a tour of the vice presidential residence so that she could figure out how to child-proof the home before her and her husband moved in. And Kamala Harris apparently did not return her calls.
Yeah, I had read that somewhere. I mean, that is certainly interesting if true that there's that degree of frostiness. It is normally the case in transitions that there is a basic level of civility. I mean, that's why, for example, Biden invited Trump to the White House, and at the time he said that he was going to try to ensure a smooth transition and all of that. Trump has complained that it hasn't been that smooth a transition. Susie Wiles, his campaign manager, has suggested that it was, and so these debates, you know, go on and on. I did not see, and correct me if I'm wrong, any official response from Harris's team to the suggestion that she had not responded to Vance. So I'm not sure what the truth of the matter is there in terms of whether anything got lost in the weeds or whether it was an intentional snub. I do think on a human level it has to be pretty difficult to be present. I mean, Hillary Clinton went in 2017 following losing to Trump in the 2016 election, and I get that is a difficult experience for people who've been competing for the highest office in the land, but it's probably worth trying to ensure some modicum of recognition of the transition of power, I think.
I feel compelled to point out here as well that I was reading another People magazine piece yesterday.
This is excellent. You're a People magazine correspondent.
Exactly. Very rare for me to read tabloid magazines, but I got sucked in because there was this article posted on X from People with 19 never-before-seen official photos from the White House. And I thought, oh, this ought to be interesting. So I went through and I was looking at all the photos, and most of them were kind of what you would expect: Biden signing student loan forgiveness, at the Easter egg roll, whatever. And then the 19th photo, though, felt like it was a dig at Kamala Harris. It was a photo of the vice president strolling into the Capitol on January 6th with a big smile on her face, and the caption read, "Kamala Harris enters Capitol on January 6th to certify her own election loss."
That's a bit rough. I mean, and also if she was smiling at the time. I mean, I think that particular ceremony, which she presided over in a dignified way, in my opinion. I have been critical of her about some elements of her election campaign, but I mean, I think to actually go there and preside over that is another one of these experiences that nobody can really relish, and she did it as smoothly and as undemonstratively as she reasonably could, and good for her in that respect.
Yeah, she did totally fine. I just wondered who at the White House snuck that photo in there, because I highly doubt that Vice President Harris would have wanted that in there. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Please stick around. President-elect Donald Trump and President Joe Biden are both insisting that they're the reason for the Gaza ceasefire agreement.
Biden gave a press conference this week where he shared his thoughts on who deserved credit. Let's watch.
Many peacemakers helped make this deal happen, including an extraordinary team of American diplomats who have worked nonstop for months to get this done. Secretary Blinken led the effort. Secretary Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, John Feiner, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, and the Vice President worked relentlessly as we worked to deliver this deal. I'd also note this deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented, for the most part, by the next administration.
Trump, on the other hand, had a different perspective on the matter. He wrote on Truth Social, "This epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. I am thrilled American and Israeli hostages will be returning home to be reunited with their families and loved ones." Even Biden's State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller gave Trump credit this week. Here he is.
When it comes to the involvement of President-elect Trump's team, it has been absolutely critical in getting this deal over the line. So obviously, those are promises we cannot make on behalf of the United States for any longer than the next 5 days. And so it's critical that all of the parties to the agreement and the other mediators see that when the United States is in the room making commitments, those are lasting commitments that extend beyond this administration into the next one.
But White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre sang a different tune, raising eyebrows with her comments about Matthew Miller.
Karine, we're sort of dancing around who gets to take credit for this deal.
No one's dancing around here.
Our colleague at the State Department briefed our colleagues that President Trump was critical in getting this deal over the line. Do you not agree with that statement?
I mean, look, I'm not going to speak to a random person. I don't know who this person is. I'm not going to. Oh. What I can say is, look, obviously Matt Miller will speak for himself. What I can say is there are steps that were taken here that is really important and critical, and that started with this president's starting a framework that was agreed upon by the world back in May.
Meanwhile, 2 journalists were kicked out of a press conference that Secretary of State Antony Blinken was hosting at the State Department.
Security physically dragged independent journalist Sam Husseini out of the briefing and also escorted Grey Zone News' Max Blumenthal out.
Both of these journalists interrupted Blinken's remarks to criticize his handling of the war in Gaza. Let's watch.
You pontificate about a free press. You pontificate about a free press. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. I'm asking questions after being told by Matt Miller that he will not answer my questions until I ask him questions.
Please, sir, respect the process. Please, sir, respect the process.
Oh, respect the process. Respect the process while everybody from Amnesty International, to the ICJ is saying that Israel's doing genocide and extermination. You're telling me to respect the process. Criminal, why aren't you in The Hague?
Screenwriter Randy Singer said on Blue Sky, grateful for the ceasefire in Gaza, also grateful all the California fire experts can now become ceasefire deal experts.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote on X, Trump celebrates what he called the epic ceasefire agreement, saying it only happened because he won and Biden and Harris lost in November, which is obviously true.
So first of all, I would like to offer a defense of Karine Jean-Pierre in that exchange, because I think that got blown out of proportion. When you look at the transcript, because it wasn't quite clear from the audio what the reporter was asking, to me it's pretty clear. The reporter doesn't initially say who said it. She says something about a briefing at the State Department or from someone at the State Department. And it seems pretty clear to me that Karine Jean-Pierre thought she was being asked about some anonymous source saying something. And then when it was identified as Miller, she said Matt Miller can speak for himself, which is fine. And Miller obviously did credit Trump a bit more than Karine Jean-Pierre did. But the bigger issues here, I think, are both obviously the ceasefire deal itself and the what happened with those reporters. We were talking off camera a little bit about the reporters. I think we both have mixed feelings in some ways about it, but do you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. I'll start with the Karine Jean-Pierre thing. I think that she did mishear. I mean, she did ultimately address that it was Matt Miller, but I guess she probably should have mentioned that because it became such a weird moment. But also in her other commentary in regards to the ceasefire agreement, she did, as that reporter put it, kind of dance around whether or not Trump deserves credit. And I will say, from an administrative standpoint, if you talk to people who were former press secretaries or worked in comm shops, that's a message that has to be locked tight across the administration. You cannot have somebody in the State Department and somebody at the White House briefing room podium sharing two different messages about a matter as important as this.
Well, I do agree with that, Amber, but I mean, I think it's a difficult needle to thread for a press secretary, because at Biden's remarks, which we showed, we described them as a press conference, which I don't think they were really. He didn't really take any questions except at the very end. But at the very end, he was asked something to the effect of, do you or Trump deserve credit for this? And he said, is that a joke? Having previously said that the Trump team and his own team spoke as one team or with one voice or something. So to the extent that the message is a bit conflicted, I think that is emanating more from Biden than from his
Yeah, that's an
spokespeople.
interesting point, and it does speak to this broader tension, perhaps, between the State Department and the White House, because according to reports from Jackie Heinrich, Karine Jean-Pierre did not want to share the podium with John Kirby on her final day in the briefing room, even though there was this sort of historic ceasefire agreement that came down.
I have had, anyway, I won't grumble. Well, let's just move on to...
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's get into these journalists being pulled out of the State Department. Look, I would typically never defend the Biden administration or any administration for that matter trying to deny access to journalists. It's happened to me before. It's awful and unfortunate. However, these individuals did not seem to be behaving like journalists. They were there as activists, I think. They were shouting over the speech. They were making claims that are entirely of their own opinion, that what was happening in Gaza was a genocide, that Tony Blinken was responsible for this genocide. And to me, that didn't seem like someone who was there in good faith to ask a question to elicit information for the American people. It was someone who wanted to lob accusations.
Yeah, I have honestly very conflicted feelings about this, and I know sometimes in debate, it is much easier to be like, these guys are on the side of good or on the side of evil. I agree with you that they appeared to be acting more as activists than journalists. Now, I think they would argue that there is a moral imperative to do that sometimes, and that they clearly feel that the situation in Gaza is of sufficient gravity to do it. When Max Blumenthal interrupted Blinken, though, he was talking about things like, why did you allow my friends to be massacred, which is a reference, I think, to Palestinian journalists, said that he had waved the white flag for Netanyahu. Now, the point about, say something like waving the white flag for Netanyahu, I think you could ask, I mean, I quite like adversarial questions. I've asked my share of them myself on this topic, including of Mr. Kirby. But in relation to these things to Blinken, it seemed to be the shouting of statements rather than trying to elicit an answer. If you had said the Biden administration has done X, Y, and Z, does that amount to a waving of the white flag to Benjamin Netanyahu? Completely valid question that I would certainly support asking. Cutting in to start screaming at someone doesn't seem to me really to be journalistic activity. It seems, as you point out, to be activist activity.
Yeah, it's akin to shouting down a speaker on a college campus. Right. And you're right, there's a way to frame adversarial questions that separates it from your own personal opinion and is supported by facts and evidence. And that's something that, you know, we have to do all the time when we're crafting how we want to approach an issue in any administration. On the ceasefire itself, I guess I have a little bit of caution of people celebrating too early. This is phase one. There's 2 more phases after that, which will take place over a period of about 90 days. And neither side seems super thrilled about this. Netanyahu delayed the signing of the ceasefire agreement, and then you have apparently one of the Hamas leaders already promising to commit another October 7th. So I would be honestly a little bit surprised if we even get to stage 2 at this point, when there is still so much acrimony and bad blood between these 2 state actors.
Yeah, I think it is always useful or worthwhile to be skeptical of whether multi-phase peace agreements are going to actually come into force. I hope they do. I think that the situation in Gaza is horrendous, and I would hope that it would cease. But I think there is obviously a lot of political complexity to it, and there is vast amounts of distrust and enmity on both sides. We'll see. I mean, as you and I are talking, I believe the Israeli cabinet is going to be voting in terms of its verdict on this deal. But look, I hope that they find a way to have a ceasefire. It would not surprise me at all if it all fell apart.
It's sort of reminiscent of the deal that Trump was negotiating with the Taliban and the Afghan government, which was a multi-stage, conditions-based withdrawal from the country, and he never got there. So we'll continue to follow it, of course. We'll see how this ends up shaking out. But up next, stick around, because we're interviewing journalist Ken Klippenstein about an interesting provision in the TikTok bill. Stay tuned. For thee, not for me. That's the subject of independent journalist Ken Klippenstein's recent Substack. The Supreme Court decided this morning to uphold the ban on the app, which goes into effect on Sunday. Klippenstein obtained State Department documents that revealed the Biden administration, quote, carved out a loophole for itself so the TikTok ban won't apply to certain government staff, according to a document signed by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Even though the ByteDance app TikTok is set to be banished, in his piece, he highlights the irony behind the U.S. government's move. Select State Department employees will be allowed to remain on the Chinese-owned platform for public diplomacy purposes, or, as the secretive document puts it, promoting U.S. interests abroad.
In Klippenstein's words, quote, while the Biden administration is trying to ban Chinese-owned TikTok over concerns about foreign influence operations, the White House is quietly working to use TikTok for its own foreign influence activities. Joining us now to discuss the bombshell revelation is Ken himself. Welcome, Ken.
Hey guys, good to be back.
Absolutely, good to have you. So just expand on what we said there in the introduction. It appears to be a pretty clear example of double standards, or of one rule for the general mass of the population and another rule for government employees. But Talk us through it.
Yeah, this is really a case of restrictions for thee, but not for me. In this case, public diplomacy officials, that's the State Department's word, their polite word for propaganda aimed at foreign audiences. State Department officials engaged in that enjoy a carve-out under this policy, which, by the way, they didn't announce publicly. They did internally, and you can guess why that was, because it flies in the face of the case they're making about TikTok, that it's, just such an informational threat to the public that, they can't be trusted to handle it. On the other hand, we, the federal government, some of us at least, can be. And so if you look at the document, it's really revealing. It says that, look, guys, there's a huge opportunity cost associated with dropping this platform. We are not going to be able to message to foreign audiences whatever it is we want to tell them to advance U.S. Geopolitical interests if we don't use it. So you guys have to let us use it. And I don't think that's necessarily an unreasonable argument, but that's also an argument that can be made for the millions of people that use the platform to put forth whatever their creative thoughts are or political thoughts or whatever it may be. And so then the question is, why is the danger not serious enough that you have to worry about people working for the government being affected by it, but not the general public?
How does this square as well with the fact that in 2023, the White House ordered federal employees to wipe TikTok from their phones? Did State Department employees enjoy a similar carve-out with that sort of internal ban?
Yep, exactly. And what you just mentioned is one of several contradictions at the heart of all of this. Another one being that both President Biden and Vice President Harris in their election campaigns used TikTok extensively to message to the public. And I can understand why they would want to do that, because there's a heck of a lot of people on there that you're not going to be able to reach on other platforms. The heart of the argument about whether, as the Supreme Court just decided against, about whether this de facto ban affects the First Amendment protected speech of Americans, sort of hinges on this question of whether they're going to be able to express those same thoughts on other platforms. And that's what's so interesting about these documents, is it suggests that the answer to that question is no, because these platforms are so important and so unique that you can't just post the same, in this case, State Department propaganda, to put it candidly, on Instagram or on Facebook or on YouTube. This is the federal government saying that internally, we don't want to deal with these inferior platforms that are not going to have the same audiences and not going to have the same mechanisms of storytelling that TikTok will, not have the same algorithm and so forth. So internally, they recognize that there's a significant difference between these things, and there's just certain things you can do on TikTok that you can't do elsewhere. And I wish that would have had some ramifications with regard to the case before SCOTUS. And they had considered, why is the federal government doing this if there's no difference between these platforms? Because that's kind of the big argument is, oh, well, you can just put this stuff on YouTube, or you can just put it on, whatever it is. What's the big difference? Well, it turns out the government knows there's a difference and they care about it.
And Ken, just a few minutes before we started this conversation, the White House released a statement in regards to that SCOTUS decision, essentially punting the issue to Donald Trump, saying, given the sheer fact of timing, this administration recognizes that actions to implement the law simply must fall to the next administration, which takes office on Monday. Now, Donald Trump has expressed some willingness to perhaps delay the ban of TikTok, and some allies of his have floated the idea of actually buying the app from ByteDance themselves. How likely do you think it is that this ban actually does go into effect in the immediate future, or do you expect that Trump might make steps to either delay or overturn the law?
Well, this could also go to the Supreme Court, because it was a law that was passed by the Congress, and the question is, can, via executive fiat, the president override that? I don't know the answer to that question. I think it is a complicated issue. But what's interesting about all this is that when the law was passed, and as we see the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress, like Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, scramble to try to hold off implementation of the law they passed and signed into law, I think all this shows how disingenuous they were when they told the public, oh, don't worry, this isn't a ban. They said this repeatedly. This is not a ban. All it's doing is making it so that someone has to buy it, and someone will buy it. It turns out no one has bought it yet. So, there's debate about why. Some people think that it's because TikTok won't accept offers. I tend to think that if that was the case, whoever offered that TikTok didn't respond to would have went public with it in order to try to pressure them to accept the deal. But whatever the case is, Congress was disingenuous when they told everyone, oh, don't worry about it, nothing's going to happen because someone will buy it. Clearly that hasn't happened. So I think they have egg on their face, and that's why they're, falling all over themselves trying to make it so that this thing doesn't get shut down, because it's not just entertainment. People might know this app is something that you watch funny videos on, but there are, huge numbers of small businesses and people that rely on this platform to be able to sell things upon which they depend on for their income and their livelihood. And all of that is something that Congress and the Biden White House should have anticipated would happen. Instead, they told the public what seems to have been a lie, which was, don't worry, someone will buy it, it'll be fine.
And in relation to that, Ken, it seems like you view this, not just as a sort of an unwelcome and unjustified suppression of free speech or of people's free choice, but also as a political mistake on the part of those who advocated for the ban, right? You think they've got the politics wrong as well as the ethics?
Yeah, I've reported on this extensively, and what I found was the national security concerns were entirely hypothetical. If you look at the testimony before Congress on the part of the CIA director, the director of national intelligence, the FBI director, all of them talk about things that could happen, but they don't have anything to point to about what has happened. And, proponents of the ban might say that I'm being naive. Why wouldn't the Chinese do this at some point? The second point that I would make is, what is the evidence for that disinformation campaigns are particularly effective? We can go back to 2016. The Democrats spent years trying to show that Russian disinformation had some kind of determinative effect on the election then. I don't think they ever sustained that case. I think most people don't see that they did. And the same is here. How is this so important? Is this such an existential threat to the information space in the United States that we are willing to throw out not just all the people that depend on this for their livelihood, but our speech rights? And I think the answer to that question should be no, yeah.
Ken Klippenstein, thanks for joining us once again on Rising. Always a pleasure to hear from you, and certainly an important topic.
Thank you for having me, guys.
President Joe Biden has given 50 years of his life to public service. Hailing from Scranton, Pennsylvania, he came to Washington in 1972 after winning the Senate race in Delaware. He remained in Washington for the next half-century, during which he became Barack Obama's vice president from after the 2008 election in 2009 through early 2017. He climbed to the highest position in US government, winning the presidency in 2020. He defended his presidency in a farewell speech Wednesday and issued a warning. Take a look.
It will take time to feel the full impact of all we've done together. But the seeds are planted, and they'll grow and they'll bloom for decades to come. At home, we've created nearly 17 million new jobs, more than any other single administration, a single term. More people have health care than ever before. And overseas, we've strengthened NATO. Ukraine is still free. And we've pulled ahead of our competition with China. And so much more. I'm so proud of how much we've accomplished together. I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. And this is a dangerous and that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. And the dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead.
We are calling on distinguished Professor of History Allan Lichtman to discuss the Biden legacy because I recognize he's a renowned authority on American history and politics. Lichtman's books have won major national awards, and I've often sought his commentary and insight for The Hill. Welcome, Allan.
Thank you so much.
So obviously, President Biden is leaving office with rather lukewarm approval ratings, to say the least. I mean, pretty low by historical levels. But we have also seen some presidents of whom that is true be judged more kindly by history over time. So what's your overall take on what the outgoing president's legacy will be?
Yeah, I'm often asked this at the end of a presidential term, and I'm sometimes tempted to invoke the old Zen saying, unask the question. Because as Biden pointed out in the clip you showed, it takes many years to fully judge the accomplishments or problems of a presidency. But I'll give you my take on the first draft of the Biden legacy. And like the legacy of most American presidents, it's a mixed one. As he rightly pointed out, he has major accomplishments, but also significant setbacks. On the accomplishments, it was Biden and Biden alone who put together the coalition of the West that stopped Putin from quickly conquering Ukraine, that's kept Ukraine alive for some 2.5 years, and kept Putin from threatening America's national security by going after our European allies. It was on Biden's watch that we finally got a brokered ceasefire and partial hostage release in the Middle East. I understand Trump played a role in that, but this was based on a framework that Biden had set out way back in May of 2024 and had worked diligently to achieve. In domestic policy, Biden has more accomplishments than any president since the 1960s. The stimulus bill that brought us out of the deep recession, the CHIPS bill, the bill to reduce drug prices, the infrastructure bill, the bill to aid veterans injured by the burn pits, the climate change and tax bill. It's an extraordinary legacy of legislative accomplishments. On the other hand, we know there are real setbacks, and the president's tenure ends in what I would call a real enigma. The Biden administration got off on the wrong foot with the disastrous optics of the Afghan withdrawal. The American people are expecting competence after the chaos of 4 years of Donald Trump, and they didn't get it in that first impression. And you know, you never overcome a first impression. He also had near record high inflation in his first 2 years, and inflation, its impact doesn't end. It reverberated throughout the administration. And perhaps most significantly, he never developed a compelling message to reverberate with the American people. So regardless of all his accomplishments, they were never really recognized by the American people, and that hurt him in terms of extending his legacy through a second Democratic administration. We also don't know the full story about the president's cognitive issues. We may never know, but we may at some point. But we do know that he was the only elected president on the eve of the national convention of his party to be openly and viciously trashed by members of his own party, by the leaders of his own party, and be forced to withdraw his candidacy and be cemented in as a one-term president. Now, I say his legacy ends in enigma. As you point out, his approval ratings leaving the White House are historically low. And in the past, when presidents have had that kind of low approval, it's because of one of two things: either an bitingly war gone sour, like the Korean War or the Vietnam War, or a terrible economic decline like the recession of 2008 or 2020. We didn't see any of that on Biden's watch, and yet his approval ratings are the kind of down in the dumps record that you would expect on a sour war or a bad economy. Historians, political scientists, and commentators will be examining for a long time why Biden never resonated with the American people and leaves office, despite all these accomplishments, with such a dismal rating.
Well, Alan, I actually don't think it's that difficult to figure out. I mean, we had rampant inflation throughout the Biden administration, a crisis at the southern border with millions of illegal aliens coming across from Mexico. You also had an increase in foreign conflict, whether it was the war in Ukraine or the conflict between Israel and Hamas. We also had a cover-up of the president's cognitive decline. And at the end of his time in power, he decides to give a blanket pardon to his son after accusing his political opponent of being the one weaponizing the Justice Department and being corrupt. I mean, those are just a few of the issues, not to mention the Afghanistan withdrawal, which you mentioned, which was more than just an optics problem. It was a competence problem. So, I mean, given all of that, is it any surprise that Biden's approval rating sits at 33% as he leaves office?
It is a surprise. I mean, you present that in the way, the Republican talking points would present it. There wasn't rampant inflation, for example, throughout the Biden administration.
9% isn't.
He brought inflation, let me finish. He brought inflation down by about 2/3 to 3/4. Inflation is now back down to about just over 2%.
2.9%.
And it was the world, not just Joe Biden, that suffered from high inflation in the transition from the pandemic. And Biden built the strongest economy in the world. It's been marred by a lot of disinformation.
By what
no
measure is
other
the economy
world
the strongest in the world?
Matches the economy that Biden has built. And in terms of the foreign conflicts, as we said, it was Biden who kept Ukraine alive from the aggression of Putin. It's Biden who worked diligently for so many months to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. It's Biden who actually brought down the influx of immigrants and who worked in a bipartisan fashion to develop a new comprehensive immigration reform bill that Donald Trump killed. So, yeah,
Alan, how could you credibly argue that Biden,
but it's not comparable to a recession or a sour war.
Alan, how could you credibly argue that Biden reduced the number of illegal immigrants when it was his policies that led to the massive increase in the first place? That's like saying, I set my house on fire, but then I put it out.
Look, you got to credit Biden with what he did. He reduced the illegal immigration down to levels equal or lower than where they were on the Trump administration and brokered a deal to solve the problem that Trump killed, not Biden. And moreover, we have vast amount of disinformation about undocumented immigrants. We've got this disinformation that they're these vicious criminals, that they're these killers, that they're eating your pets, all of which is false. Undocumented immigrants are the most law-abiding segment of our society. Study after study shows they commit crimes, including violent crimes, less than half the rate of Native Americans. So I think a lot of the problems that Biden's face is what he pointed out in his farewell address, the control of oligarchs like Elon Musk over our sources of information. It's been reported that Elon Musk's disinformation was seen by over 2 billion viewers.
Alan,
it's very difficult to establish a legacy in an era of disinformation controlled by a very few.
Alan, I wanted to get back to the domestic point that you were making in relation to Biden's domestic achievements not being fully recognized as you see it. Other presidents, for example, former President Obama had the Affordable Care Act, which was obviously a signature achievement that, many people disagreed with, but was nonetheless something that you could kind of hang your political hat on, so to speak. Do you think Biden suffered by the lack of those kind of accomplishments?
Oh, absolutely. I do think Biden very much suffered by the coverage of his administration and fundamentally by his own inability to sell his accomplishments to the American people. I have a live show every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern at Allan Lichtman YouTube. For over a year, I have been blasting the Democrats for their terrible messaging. It could not be worse. They have yet to develop a simple, compelling message. The most compelling message I heard from the Democrats was after the election, a few days before Biden was going to leave, that very powerful farewell address. Why hadn't we heard that kind of ringing declarations over the 4 years of the Biden administration? The presidency is not just a policy-making body. It's also a means of connecting with the American people and promoting the politics that are necessary to preserve your legacy and carry out your vision. And Biden and the entire Democratic Party could not have been more deficient in that regard.
Allan Lichtman, a distinguished professor of history, we appreciate you joining us, a spirited conversation, and thanks for joining Rising.
Thank you. Excellent conversation. I appreciated it.
Speculation from those on the political right are swirling over who exactly is staffing the intelligence community and if that person is trying to stop President-elect Trump's agenda.
This seems to have started with a piece in Tablet magazine titled "The Deep State Strikes Back." The outlet writes, quote, "Congressional and intelligence sources tell Tablet that the candidate slotted in for the top intelligence spot on the National Security Council is ill-suited to serve the president's agenda." Citing congressional sources, the outlet continues, multiple House members have raised concern over an alleged boast made by Republican Ohio Congressman Turner on Capitol Hill that he's, quote, "taking over Trump's intelligence community."
Trump's incoming national security advisor Mike Waltz and Turner himself, however, disputed these claims to the Daily Caller. The Caller writes, Waltz said he has not discussed NSC staffing or policy issues with Turner since he was appointed by Trump. Turner also claimed he has not been a part of any of the Trump transition team and that the anonymous report is false. Of course, Speaker Mike Johnson ended up booting Mike Turner from his House Intel Committee chair spot amid all of this.
Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries criticized Johnson's move in that respect, writing, "Mike Turner is a serious, thoughtful and highly principled leader whose work as chair of the House Intelligence Committee has been extremely impactful. Mike Turner has robustly promoted the safety of the American people and the free world, and his unjustified ouster is likely being applauded by our adversaries in Russia and China. Shameful." Connecticut Democratic Congressman Jim Himes also weighed in, writing on X, "Mike Turner is dedicated to national security and thoughtful oversight of the intelligence community. His removal makes our nation less secure and is a terrible portent for what's to come. The Constitution demands Congress function as a check on the executive branch, not cater to its demands."
The Federalist editor-in-chief Molly Hemingway wrote, "Interesting how Democrats are far more upset about Mike Turner being removed from the Intel Committee than any Republicans." Independent journalist Glenn Greenwald also chimed in, writing, "Truly hilarious, but also so revealing. The GOP House Intel chair removed by Speaker Johnson yesterday, Mike Turner, is a blind loyalist to and puppet of the U.S. security state, CIA, and NSA. So, of course, Dem leader Hakeem Jeffries loves him and attacks GOP for removing him." So this is a really fascinating story as we get into the staffing of the Trump administration and then how the Congress is going to deal with their role in helping to advance the Trump agenda. And essentially all of this does stem from that Tablet report, which claimed that Mike Turner was bragging about how his top guy was going to be on the NSC under Mike Waltz and was going to be sort of his man in charge there. And since then, Republicans have been eager to knock down that story. We talked to Mike Waltz, who denied that it was the case, said he's only going to bring in people who are interested in executing Trump's agenda. But then there was this ouster of Mike Turner from the Intel Committee, which the timing of which kind of suggested to me that Republicans were very, very eager to tamp down any speculation that could sow distrust in the upcoming staff of Trump's intelligence community.
There definitely is a lot of interesting division and infighting going on here, which, to be fair, seems to be infighting about genuine differences of worldview, of attitude, of deeper than policy, I think, more sort of to do with outlook. And so, I would defer to your knowledge of the conservative movement much more so than my own, but it does seem to me that a lot of people in Trump world still have grievances, or regrets would be a better word perhaps, about the role played by people like John Bolton and H.R. McMaster in the first administration. People who were cut from a more neoconservative or traditionally hawkish cloth. And it seems like Mike Turner is somewhat in that mold, or at least he's, very, very pro aid to Ukraine, for example, which is something that the Trump people seem to have greater difficulty about. He has also, it seems to me at least, been more amenable to government surveillance operations and powers than is true of some of the people in Trump world. So it just seems like an interesting clash that's going on here.
That's exactly right. So the Trump administration, the people who are quite close to his worldview, have deep skepticism of the intelligence community, at least in part due to Crossfire Hurricane, which was the investigation into alleged Russian collusion, and the fact that they used some basically innuendo and hearsay to get warrants to spy on members of the Trump campaign. And then, of course, recently, some of the whistleblower testimony about attempts to hamstring an investigation into Hunter Biden. And so the Republican caucus in general has moved away from the neoconservative bent, in part because of that skepticism of the IC, but also because of a shifting opposition to regime change wars and democracy building in other parts of the world. And Mike Turner is a lot more neoconservative and establishment than the most recent bent of the party. And you mentioned his sort of openness to surveillance of Americans. He was actually very instrumental in the renewing of FISA Section 702 and was lobbying hard to prevent the more civil liberties sensitive Republicans from getting rid of the ability to conduct warrantless spying on non-American citizens, foreign adversaries. But American citizens' communications often get caught up in those surveillance measures. So he was basically on a tear against getting rid of that warrantless spying. He also, on several cases, seemed to take the intelligence community's word for their ability to basically say with authority how they were doing as a whole on regards to certain issues. And what I mean by that is he was very resistant to the idea that COVID-19 came from a lab. He wanted to wait until the top intelligence agencies released their reports, even though there had already been a lot from the State Department that had come out in relation to that. And he also denied the fact that the Afghanistan withdrawal was an intelligence failure. He said that this was solely a Biden competence failure. I'm sure that's partially true, but it was also an intelligence failure. So he seems to like to parrot the things that members of the quote-unquote deep state tell him.
Yeah, I mean, the deep state lexicon, I tend to roll my eyes about it a little bit. But in relation to I think that there are a lot of valid points raised there, but in relation to the COVID thing, which I had also read that he wanted to wait until all the agencies came forward, that to me seems appropriately circumspect rather than a marker of whatever it's supposed to be, nefarious intent. No?
I would normally agree, except for the fact that this was in March of 2023, which is well past the time that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other non-IC groups had conducted their own research into the origins of COVID and had determined with reasonable certainty that it did leak from a lab as opposed to being of natural origin. And so it felt like he was sort of clinging to that last final thread that he could to push back on that narrative at the behest of the intelligence community.
I mean, I think, there are obviously different elements of the intelligence community have different views on that. But I guess the point here is ultimately Turner is out. He's out not only as chair, but he has to now leave the committee because rank and file members are confined to 6 years of service there, and he's at 10 apparently. So he's done, and another victory for Mr. Trump.
Yeah, and people close to the decision to oust him as well say that this was something that would have happened even if that tablet report had not come out, citing some of the things that I mentioned earlier with his general opposite view on issues related to the IC from the general Republican caucus. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I don't think that this was solely a Trump decision. It sounds like the Republican caucus as a whole was quite tired of Mike Turner and probably pretty happy to see him go.
There we go. Good intel on the House Republican conference there, Em.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
We will have more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Stay with us.
New details of President Joe Biden's ouster from the presidential campaign are unfolding right in the New York Times.
The Times, citing half a dozen sources who were involved in that push, detailed in a Friday story how Senator Chuck Schumer urged Biden to drop out of the race.
In the Times' piece, which is titled, "I'm urging you not to run, how Schumer pushed Biden to drop out," they report that Chuck Schumer told Biden, "If you run and you lose to Trump and we lose the Senate and we don't get back the House, that 50 years of amazing, beautiful work goes out the window," Mr. Schumer said. "But worse, you go down in American history as one of the darkest figures." The Times continues, "He would end with a directive. If I were you," Mr. Schumer said, "I wouldn't run, and I'm urging you not to run." Another interesting tidbit from the Times story has to do with Biden's apparent cognitive decline. The Times writes, "For months, Mr. Schumer had been concerned that Mr. Biden was going to lose to Mr. Trump and cost Democrats Congress. It wasn't that he thought Mr. Biden was not capable of the job. During their weekly conversations, the president often rambled, but he had always rambled. Once in a while, Mr. Biden would forget why he called, but Mr. Schumer thought little of it. He was convinced that Mr. Biden could handle the job." Here's a clip of Chuck Schumer earlier this month defending Biden's mental acuity.
Leader Schumer, what do you say to Americans who feel as though you and other top Democrats misled them about President Biden's mental acuity?
Look, we didn't, and let's look at President Biden. He's had an amazing record. The legislation we passed, one of the most significant groups of legislation since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, putting in 235 judges, a record, and he's a patriot. He's a great guy.
Democratic Senator Ron Wyden confirmed to CNN that Schumer did indeed urge Biden to drop out. Here he is.
What is your reaction to this, and did you feel at this time that the president should have stopped his bid?
Well, first of all, Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden have a long relationship. Chuck was a credible and persuasive connection because they go back to the years working on Judiciary Committee issues. That was a real common bond for them. So I think that was the right move for Senate Democrats to reach out through Senator Schumer.
Well, all rather messy. I mean, all goes back to the sort of original political sin, in a way, of Joe Biden deciding to run for re-election, having previously talked about the fact that he could be a transitional president. And that then led to a whole cascade of effects. And one of those effects was that lots of Democrats had to effectively bail in to defend him, or to purport to have no concerns about his cognitive abilities. It is true that Joe Biden has rambled or been loquacious for a long time. It is true that he has had a propensity for verbal gaffes for a long time. But when that now infamous debate rolled around, it was quite obvious, I think, that that man could not win an election, and were he to somehow do so, it would be very difficult to see him serve in another 4 years. And so off we went on the course of events that we're all familiar with. It is a bit, Chuck Schumer now is in this peculiar position where there are all these clips of him defending Biden, and now pretty authoritative reporting from the Times that he had wanted Biden to drop out, and had now the issue of exactly what concerns he had about that are phrased in a slightly interesting way. But the point is, lots of people had worries about Joe Biden, wanted him to drop out, and he didn't.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that they simultaneously say that Biden would call Schumer and forget what he had called for, but that Schumer wasn't worried at all.
He was fine with that.
Yeah, he just thought that was normal.
Right.
I mean, I guess there's two possibilities. Either they're still kind of covering for themselves, or they were so within this bubble of convincing themselves and others that Biden was fine that they really couldn't see what was right in front of their face. But it was obviously deeply problematic for the party because they wait until after you can't keep it a secret anymore to finally force Biden out, and then they don't seemingly have a great plan for how exactly to replace him. They end up with Kamala Harris, who ends up not being a very good candidate, and all of the problems that they had with Biden heading into the election sort of reemerged with her, and they weren't able to really I think, increase their chances by as much as they were expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of criticisms of Kamala Harris. I think I probably gauge her as a slightly more effective candidate than you do, but obviously not an amazing candidate. And the whole problem, I think, with Biden's refusal to drop out was if he was going to cease to be the nominee, at that stage it was going to be Harris, because to throw her overboard or to leap past her would have caused vast problems in the Democratic coalition, because at a very late stage you would have been jumping over a black woman who was the sitting vice president of the United States, and that was going to cause all sorts of difficulties. I think in a contested primary, if Biden had said, well, I'm going to leave it at one term and whoever's the nominee is the nominee, you would have had, firstly, more testing of Harris herself, but you would also have had the possibility, at least, of someone else emerging. Now, who that would be, we could run down the list. It's not clear that any of them would have won. It is possible that problems related to inflation and immigration in particular, which were big vulnerabilities, would have ultimately cost Democrats the election. Harris lost the popular vote by a little over 1%, but obviously did lose the Electoral College convincingly, Trump winning all of the 7 key swing states. So I think that the sequence of events that I just outlined there is one that obviously causes Democrats an enormous amount of angst, because they now have this guy who they do view as an existential threat to American democracy back in power, or about to be, come January the 20th, come Monday. And it's like, how could we have avoided that? And Biden staying in office for so long is a central part of that argument.
And his public endorsement of his vice president before, according to all reports, the leaders of the Democratic Party outside of Biden, including Obama, Schumer, and Pelosi, had decided how they wanted to proceed once Biden dropped out. He basically painted them into a corner, and there's questions as to whether that was intentional to try to stick it to these people who were running the party when he was supposed to be the leader as the president, or whether it was a well-meaning sort of nod to his VP. And even now, Biden has said in several interviews that he still thinks that he would have beat Trump.
Yeah, I know.
And it's just delusional. I mean, the guy was polling the worst against Trump that any of his opponents ever have. And I mean, I don't see how he could have viewed any of the internal polling or the polling on the issues as being favorable to him in any way. I just don't understand it.
Right, and the whole reason that the Democratic Party went through the ructions it went through was because of the recognition that he was 99.9% certain to lose, especially after that debate. And the combination of age and cognitive issues was something that added to an existing list of inflation, immigration, and also things that really inflamed the left, notably his policy on Israel and Gaza. So look, there was just, I think, the recognition that he couldn't win. It is bizarre to me that he still doesn't see that. I mean, I guess none of us ever see ourselves as other people do, but the idea that he was going to win the election when so many people looked at his apparent cognitive decline, I mean, that was just never going to happen.
No, it kind of, I don't know, maybe it was Dr. Jill telling him what he wanted to hear.
We shall see. Who knows? Exactly. We still have more topics to talk about in Rising, so stick with us. We'll be back after this.
Bill Maher is not holding back when it comes to criticizing California's leadership.
The comedian and talk show host was a guest on TMZ, where he aired his grievances. Let's listen.
Now, as far as the red tape, I see that they're all, Newsom, Bass, they're all saying, we're going to cut red tape, as if they're doing us a favor. My question is, well, if you can do it now, why don't you always do it? Obviously, it can be done. It's not a favor to us to cut the red tape. Why do we live in this state, in this red tape nightmare, the other times of the year when we're not on fire? I always think there's a middle of the road, actual practical solution to everything. And for this, I would say, was California's uber progressive politics the cause of this fire? Of course not. Did it impede them to some degree? Absolutely. That's the margin of error I'm saying we can't abide by anymore.
California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order earlier this month that suspended regulations under the California Environmental Quality Act.
Newsom said he made the move so victims of the fire could rebuild their homes more quickly. California State Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks wrote on X, "I commend Governor Newsom for taking swift action to streamline rebuilding efforts. Thousands of families who have lost everything should not be subjected to bureaucratic red tape, normally taking years in their effort to rebuild their lives."
Venture capitalist Bill Gurley felt differently, writing, "It's become popular for elected leaders to show they are adding value by temporarily moving red tape processes to the sideline. The right answer is obviously reconsidering the rules holistically. Otherwise, it just gives the rule pardoner even more power."
Well, I mean, we could battle again over the response to the wildfires, which we probably have different views on. I mean, Bill Maher, who I have said before, sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I disagree with him.
I feel the same way.
I like the fact that he's somewhat unpredictable when so many people are predictable. I note on the negative side, because I think he can be very narcissistic at times, that one of his arguments about red tape was that he's having difficulty installing solar panels on his shed in the garden or something, which, you know, relative to the destruction caused by the California wildfires seems rather limited to me. But look, you know, one of my whole issues with this is often the lack of specificity in what people are actually saying. And so here he says that where California's progressive politics, the cause of this fire, of course not, but did they impede them? Absolutely. I don't know exactly what he means, and you could get into all of that. But what did you make of his overall argument is about bureaucracy, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to people who are in California, I don't know the specifics of California's regulations in relation to building homes, but people who are from there do say it is both very difficult and very expensive to build in California, which is part of what has led to the massive housing shortage there. And they feel like the temporary suspension of the red tape or regulations in regards to rebuilding is nice, but not sufficient to fully address the problem with why California has this housing crisis. Again, I'm not an expert on their housing regulations, so I can't say for sure that that's the case. I would defer to them. But I tend to agree that if the regulation is worth suspending in a time of emergency, then it's probably worth looking at whether you should get rid of it for permanently.
I don't disagree with that. I think that if there is a regulation, I mean, there has to be some imperative to have the regulation in the first place. Now, it may be the case that there are some exceptional circumstances in which it is valid to loosen standards or to be a bit more lax about that. But the idea that it can be done away with and presumably will be reimposed at some point in the future, I would, again, to the point of specificity, I would just like to get down to what that actually means and what the regulations are that Newsom is referring to and that Bill Maher is referring to. Sometimes I think he has a tendency to pose as some great sort of moral hero when all he's really saying is, oh, well, on one side, on the other side. But because he says it in this sort of more combative way, he kind of thinks that he's taking some brave stance, which I'm often skeptical about.
Yeah, I tend to agree that he does think very highly of himself. And there's been this sort of tendency from conservatives to latch on to these cultural figures that say a couple of things that sound a little bit right-wing, but still identify with the other side politically. So Bill Maher, of course, has called out political correctness and wokeness on the left, and in this case, I wouldn't expect him to actually go against regulations, so that's kind of interesting to me. But still considers himself a liberal guy, and certainly on a lot of other social and political issues would not be aligned with conservatives.
Right.
And so conservatives have this tendency, again, to sort of embrace this person, to want to welcome them into the fold, which can be great because you end up with people like Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn or even Mark Zuckerberg, I guess, at this point. But it also leaves you open to getting burned and embarrassed. And with Bill Maher in particular, people need to be very careful because this guy is not beholden to either political party. He has shown that he likes to be a little bit of a contrarian, a little bit of an independent thinker, and still is a pretty liberal guy. So whenever he says things like this, I'm always like, guys, just remember, he's right in this case. You can praise him for being right. But that doesn't mean he's suddenly one of us.
And to be fair, he has been very explicit about that himself. I saw another interview with him very recently where he said that sometimes he gets kind of bemused by Republicans or conservatives who believe that they are eventually going to lure him onto their team, that it's this gradual move to the right that he's in the middle of. And he is very emphatic that it's not a gradual move to the right that he's in the middle of. He regards, as I do, January the 6th, 2021 to be a gross offence and anti-democratic. He regards the Republican Party in large part, I think, as sympathetic to undemocratic or authoritarian views. But also in addition to that, his main difficulty, as far as I can tell, with the left is what he terms wokeness, and also, you know, he's very, very pro-Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. You know, he's entitled to his opinion. I have been critical sometimes of the most assertively woke positions on things like the trans issue, which I think is both electorally damaging and sometimes sort of flies in the face of common sense, particularly where sports is concerned. So this is what I mean about having mixed feelings about him. There's something about his manner that I don't really love. I find it can be a bit pompous, but I do think that he's someone who genuinely displays some kind of level of independence of thought without just being somebody who used to be on the left and is now on the right.
Yeah, there is sort of a market now for people like the latter that abandon the left for republicanism or conservatism, and some people have done it with not the best of intentions or motivations, and it's more of a profit-making decision that they have. There's others who are sincere about their desire to leave. And then there's others who leave the left but don't become full card-carrying members of MAGA who end up frustrating other conservatives because they claim to speak for a movement that they've only recently become part of. So it is a sort of very complicated part of the political realignment that we've been experiencing in this country, and it's messy, and it's going to take a while, I think, for some of these sort of left-right overlaps to iron themselves out.
No, absolutely, and I know we have to wrap soon, but I do think that there's a mirror image of that on the right, where I think that there are Republicans who have sincere objections to Donald Trump and sincere major problems with him, and I also think there are grifters really who just sort of are now presented as conservative or Republican when they don't appear to espouse any conservative or Republican beliefs anymore, even though they may have done at one time.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, we have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising. Stay tuned right after this. It seems like President-elect Donald Trump just can't stop making new friends. New York City Mayor Eric Adams is in Mar-A-Lago Friday meeting with Trump. The pair is reportedly discussing the incoming administration's illegal immigration crackdown, which stands to impact New York's roughly 3.1 million immigrant population. The meeting's timing, 3 days ahead of inauguration, comes as the president is mulling pardoning Adams, who has been indicted on federal corruption charges for accepting bribes from the Turkish government in exchange for political favors.
Allegedly, that is. Adams spokesperson Fabian Levi released a statement Thursday defending the sit-down, saying the mayor has, quote, made clear his willingness to work with President-elect Trump. With speculation of a pardon swirling, Adams' choice to meet Trump could present a political risk as the Democratic mayor gears up for re-election. Already, multiple challengers have jumped in to face off against Adams in the June Democratic mayoral primary. Several opponents are using their rendezvous with Trump to assail Adams. Well, this is quite an odd couple, Amber. Eric Adams indicted on 5 charges. The evidence is pretty compelling. I think he is entitled, of course, in court to the presumption of innocence, like anyone is. But I am skeptical, to say the least, that the reason for this visit is really to discuss immigration policy. I noted that, I think in the New York Times reporting, They said that Eric Adams will be travelling alone with only a security person with him. And I mean, certainly there would be widespread suspicion, I think, that what he's really interested in is a pardon from President-elect Trump.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it could be that the meeting is about immigration, but Eric Adams wants to slip in that little request
Have a little chat
from the President-elect. Look, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Is Trump going to grant it? I don't know. But I will say with Eric Adams on the immigration front, he has been, of course, very resistant to the idea that he should step aside. He wants to run for re-election. He is very obstinate in the face of these allegations. And so, for the time being, until this does go to trial, Trump is going to have to work with him to some capacity in regards to his mass deportation plans. There's a significant number of illegal aliens living in New York City right now, subject to a mandatory housing policy, by the way. And Mayor Adams has been quite vocal about the idea that he does not think the Democratic Party has been handling this issue well. They haven't been giving him the resources or the policy changes necessary for New York to be able to sustain this kind of influx. So you might see some weird bedfellows. I mean, we also saw John Fetterman going down to Mar-A-Lago recently to talk to Trump as well. There's going to be a lot of interesting crossover, I think, with this administration and the Democrats.
There's going to be a lot of interesting crossover because I think there's an odd confluence of interests, some of which are legitimate interests around immigration and how to handle immigration, and others are simply Eric Adams' obvious motivation to perhaps seek a pardon. Now, he insists that he is innocent. It is perhaps useful for our audience to just sort of briefly summarize what the allegations against him are. They are allegations of using so-called straw donors for campaign contributions, which is where the money is actually coming from someone who can't contribute to your campaign, but you put it under someone else's name to conceal it. There is also more to this than just campaign finance violations, because the suggestion or the allegation is that Adams and people close to him were given free and heavily discounted flights and hotels pertaining to Turkish Airlines or the government of Turkey. And then at a later point, Adams is alleged to have leaned on the New York Fire Department to issue clearance for a new Turkish consular building to open in New York, which it appears that clearance or approval would not otherwise have been given at that point. So you have a situation where there is a safety mandate or requirement that is allegedly being circumvented by now the current mayor of New York City, because he's getting perks from that government. It is a serious allegation, you know.
It is very serious, and if there were any argument for Trump going along with a pardon here, it's that he has said previously that he believes the only reason Mayor Adams was investigated was because of his comments against the Democratic Party on immigration. I know, he says it.
Yeah.
Is it true? I mean, gosh, I don't think so. But even if it were, that doesn't obviously get rid of the fact that there is this compelling evidence that he did engage in some massive foreign corruption business deals. But going back to the politics of this, I think it's fascinating to watch the two very extreme Democratic responses to Trump's immigration agenda. You have John Fetterman and Eric Adams, who acknowledge that the Democrats have a huge weakness on immigration. They don't support all of Trump's immigration agenda, but they're sort of willing to at least give some credence to the ideas that he's espousing and say, at the very least, we need border security. But then you have the Massachusetts governor, the mayor of Chicago, vowing that they're not going to work with the Trump administration at all on mass deportation, even as it pertains to potential criminal illegal aliens. And they are going to use their local police to basically have a standoff situation with federal immigration authorities. How do you think, Niall, the party is going to reconcile these two very diametrically opposed positions?
So they are very opposed. I think one of the things that might help them heal that division is that there are very real questions as to whether Trump can enact anything close to what he is pledging to enact. Initially, there was this idea, which is still being spoken about, of the largest deportation operation in American history. Now, other people like Tom Homan, the incoming border czar, have certainly suggested that it will initially be targeted at people who have committed crimes. That is obviously a valid point of view. It's also a much narrower population. I was interested as well to see quite recently, within the past couple of weeks, the Wall Street Journal, not typically a great voice of liberalism, writing a very good piece about the barriers that face Trump's immigration agenda in terms of really practical things like, for example, clearing the asylum backlog would generally require getting a lot more judges to hear asylum cases to ensure that you weren't then exposed to legal claims from the asylum seekers themselves that their due process laws had been violated. There are all kinds of things like that that might actually delay Trump enacting his agenda. I think Democrats broadly acknowledge that this is a vulnerable issue for them, but I also think that they are, with the exception of people like Fetterman, loath to confront their base by aligning themselves with Trump on an issue that can be so inflammatory, particularly to large parts of the Democratic base.
Yeah, I think they're also banking on the idea that there's going to be some missteps, frankly, in the mass deportation plans, where there's going to be probably some public incidents that don't look great for the Trump administration. And they're hoping that those happen soon enough that they can say, see, we told you that this was a bad idea. On the point about the asylum backlog, I mean, certainly there's a lot that would need to go through Congress to really address some of the fundamental issues with the current border crisis. But Trump has supposedly promised to implement 100 executive orders. Last time he did, 97 on his first day in office, some of those including continuing President Biden's limit on asylum seekers who don't cross at the ports of entry. So we will, of course, continue to follow this and everything relating to the incoming Trump administration, which will be sworn in on Monday. But that's going to do it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.